Close your eyes for a moment. I want you to come somewhere with me. Somewhere the air is so heavy and so wet that when you breathe it in, it feels like drinking. Somewhere the Spanish moss hangs off the live oaks in long gray beards that do not move even when the wind is moving. Somewhere the black water of the river runs so slow between the rice fields that if you stood on the bank at first light, you would not be certain at first whether it was moving at all. It is a Sunday morning in August in the year 1863. It is not yet 5 o'clock. The sun is still an hour from the horizon. The stars above the low country of South Carolina are still bright, though a few of them, in the east, are beginning to grow pale. You are standing on the back porch of a big house. 3 stories of whitewashed cypress board with a double piazza and a widow's walk on the roof from which, on a clear day, you can see the smoke of the rice barns 4 plantations away. The man who owns the house is 51 years old. His name is Augustus Vail. And behind the house, in a small brick courtyard between the kitchen and the smokehouse, stands the cage. I want you to see it clearly, because everything that happens in this story happens in the shadow of it. It is not a bird cage the way you and I might think of a bird cage. It is not a small brass thing on a table. It is an iron structure, 8 feet tall, 12 feet across, wrought in the shape of a small ornamental palace with a domed roof and thin bars twisted into vines and leaves. And inside it, on this Sunday morning in August of 1863, live 27 birds. Not chickens. Not the mockingbirds of the Carolina woods. These are the birds of a man who has spent 30 years and a great deal of his father's money collecting them. A pair of scarlet macaws from the jungles of Brazil, a gray African parrot with a red tail who has learned to say his master's name in a voice that is almost his master's. 3 cockatoos, white as bone. 2 pairs of green Amazon parrots. A dozen small yellow finches from the Canary Islands. A hoopoe from Egypt with a crest that opens like a fan. And on the highest perch in the middle of the cage, a single black bird from the island of Java, whose feathers, when the light catches them, are the color of oil on water. Every morning of Augustus Vail's adult life, every morning for the last 22 years, those 27 birds have woken up before the sun and made a noise you can hear from the far end of the plantation. Screaming, whistling, chattering, calling. It is, for every enslaved person on Blackwater Ridge Plantation, the sound their day begins with. Before the overseer's bell, before the rooster, before anything else, the birds. And every morning of the last 13 years, a woman has walked out of the quarters in the dark before the birds have even fully woken, and she has come across the yard with a covered basket in her hands. She knows all of them. Not from paper. She cannot read a word of paper. From 22 years of the same act in the same order before the same sunrise. She was 6 years old the first time Augustus Vail put the key to the cage in her hand. She is 28 years old this morning. Her name, the name her mother gave her, in a small dark cabin at the western edge of the quarters on a night in 1835 that nobody bothered to write down, is Amara. And on this Sunday morning, Amara is walking across the courtyard toward the iron cage with the covered basket in her hands, and she is stopping. She is stopping because something is wrong. There is no sound. There is no screaming of the macaws. There is no whistling of the Amazons. There is no chatter of the finches. The gray African parrot, who should by now be calling, "Augustus, Augustus, Augustus," in the voice that has always made her flinch, is silent. The cockatoos are not moving on their perches. The hoopoe is not opening its crest. The single black bird from Java on the highest perch is sitting perfectly still with its head cocked, looking not at her, not at the sky, but at something in the direction of the river. 27 birds. Not one sound. Amara stands in the courtyard in her plain gray dress with the basket in her hands, and she does not, for a very long moment, move at all, because in 22 years of walking to that cage in the dark, she has never once heard silence there. Not on the coldest morning in January, not in the middle of a summer storm, not on the morning her mother died in a cabin 60 yards away. The birds have always been there. The birds have always been loud. The birds are the one thing on Blackwater Ridge that has never, in her whole memory, stopped. And on the second floor of the big house, at the window of his study, in a nightshirt and a dressing gown, Augustus Vale is also standing very still. He has been awake since 3 o'clock in the morning. He has not slept, and he is looking through the window past the roof of the kitchen at the iron cage. And on his face, a face that Amara has seen every day of her life since she was a child, is an expression she does not recognize. Augustus Vale is terrified. He knows something. He knows something the birds know. But nobody in that courtyard, and nobody in the big house, and nobody watching from the second floor window knows what the silence means. Not Amara. Not yet. Not Augustus Vale. Not the 27 creatures behind the iron bars. And that is the question you and I are going to sit with tonight. Why did 27 birds on the morning of the 2nd of August in the year 1863 on a rice plantation on the Combahee River in South Carolina all fall silent at exactly the same moment? And what did that silence make possible? Before we go on, before I take another step toward that cage with her, I want to ask you something. Because you are going to walk with Amara in the dark of this low-country morning for the next 7,000 words. And it matters when you walk with someone that far that they know you are there. Tell me in the comments below, wherever you are listening from tonight, whatever hour of the night it is where you are, what is your name? First name only. And what time is it where you are right now as this story begins? Say your name once in the comments before we go on. Because there is nobody on Blackwater Ridge Plantation on this Sunday morning in August of 1863 who is going to say her name for her. But tonight, in this room, she is Amara. Come with me. She was born in the summer of 1835 in the small cabin at the western end of the quarters on a night that came at the tail end of a long, wet season when the mosquitoes in the marshes around Blackwater Ridge were so thick that the enslaved women of the plantation had, for the last month, been sleeping with rags soaked in kerosene folded across the windows of their cabins. Her mother's name was Nell. Her father, a man whose name she would not learn until she was 9 years old, had been sold off Blackwater Ridge the winter before she was born to a rice planter down the Ashpoo River. His name, Amara would eventually learn, had been Solomon. He had been sold, Nell said, only once, because the master decided he was becoming a man of too much opinion. Nell had 4 children before Amara. 3 of them had been sold in the winter of 1834 in a single week to settle a debt Augustus Vale's father had accumulated at the racetracks in Charleston. The 4th had died in infancy of a fever that swept through the quarters that same winter. By the time Amara was born, in the summer of 1835, her mother was 31 years old and had already, in the arithmetic of that world, lost every child she had ever carried. She held on to Amara the way a woman holds on to the last thing that is not yet gone. And she did something in those first years that was very unusual on Blackwater Ridge. She kept the child close. She did not let Amara out of her sight. When Nell was called up to the big house to help with the laundry, Amara went with her, wrapped in a shawl on Nell's back. When Nell, who had by then become the kitchen woman for Augustus Vale's mother, an old lady named Eugenia who was in the last long, slow year of her dying, was called upstairs to sit with Eugenia through the afternoon, Amara sat on the floor beside the bed, and she was, at 3 years old, so quiet that old Eugenia Vale forgot she was there. That was how she first saw the birds. Because Eugenia's bedroom on the second floor had a window that looked directly down into the brick courtyard where, in 1838, the first version of the cage stood. A smaller cage then, made of wood and wire, holding a mere handful of birds. There were 4. 2 Carolina parakeets, which is a bird you and I will never see, a bird that would be extinct within 70 years, that Amara herself would outlive by 2 decades. A single mockingbird, kept for its song, and a small green parrot that had been given to Augustus by a business friend from Havana. Old Eugenia Vale, in her last year, could not sleep well. She would sit up in her bed and look out the window at the birds, and beside her bed, on the floor, a very small, dark child sat and looked at the birds too. She would tell her own daughter, 45 years later, in a small kitchen in a small house far to the north, that the very first thing she remembered in her whole life was the flash of green from the small parrot's wing, seen through the window of a dying white woman's bedroom in the summer of 1838, when she was 3 years old. I want you to sit inside that first memory for a moment. Because most of us, when we look back to the earliest thing our minds can hold, remember a face. Our mother's face. Our father's face. The face of the person who held us in the very first light we can recall. Amara Candace's first memory of the world was not a face. It was a bird. It was a small green wing behind a wire. It was a piece of the world that could fly, seen from the floor of a room where a slow woman was dying and where a small, dark child had been placed to be as invisible as possible. Something in her, from the very beginning, went out toward the wing and not toward the room. And I think if you understand nothing else about who this woman was, you must understand that. The bird came first. The bird was the first thing she loved. Eugenia Vale died in the winter of 1839. Nell was moved out of the big house and back into the kitchen behind it. Amara, who was 4, was sent most days to work with the yard children, pulling weeds and carrying water. But something had already started. Because from the age of 4 onward, whenever Amara was allowed a moment to herself in the yard, whenever the yard woman looked away, the small dark shape would drift, without appearing to drift at all, over to the corner of the courtyard where the cage stood. And she would stand at the wire and she would look in at the birds. And the birds, over months and years, would come to the wire and look back. She began to bring them food. Not much. She could not, at 4 or 5 years old, steal from the kitchen, but she could pick up the grains of rice that fell from the sacks the field hands carried through the yard. She could gather the small windfall apples from under the tree by the smokehouse. She could crush sunflower seeds between 2 stones. And she began, in secret, to pass those small offerings through the wire. Augustus Vale caught her at it when she was 6 years old. He did not, as Amara had spent the moment of his discovery expecting him to do, strike her. He stood in the courtyard, in a dark coat with a watch chain across the front of it, and he watched the small girl at the wire of the cage. He watched the parrot take a piece of apple from her fingers. He watched the parrot, an animal that had bitten his own hand 3 times in the first year he had owned it, take the piece of apple from a 6-year-old and not bite her. And Augustus Vale said in a voice she would remember for the rest of her life, "You, girl, come here." She came. She stood in front of him with her hands at her sides. "What is your name?" "Amara," she said. "Who owns you?" "You do, sir. My mamma is Nell in the kitchen." He nodded slowly. Then he said the sentence that would decide the shape of the next 22 years of her life. "From tomorrow, you will feed the birds. Every morning, before the sun. If a single bird dies while you are the one feeding them, I will sell your mother the next day. Do you understand me, girl?" She understood him. She was 6 years old, and here is what he did not know. That morning in April of 1841, standing over her in his dark coat with the watch chain across the front of it, he did not know that he was not making her responsible for the birds because he thought her clever. He was making her responsible for the birds because he did not think of her as a person at all. He was, in his own mind, simply choosing an instrument, a small hand at a small door at a small hour. It did not occur to him that when you put an instrument in a child's hand every morning for 22 years, the child does not stay a child. The child becomes the only person on the property who knows what the instrument is for. From the next morning, Amara fed the birds. She fed them every morning of the next 22 years without a single exception. She fed them through fevers. She fed them through the winter she nearly died of pneumonia at the age of 11. She fed them on the morning her mother Nell died, in the summer of 1856, of a lung sickness that took Nell over the course of 9 days. Amara had sat by her mother's bed all night as Nell's breath got smaller and smaller, and then stopped. And then, in the last hour before dawn, she got up from the bed. She did not weep yet. She walked in her bare feet from the death cabin to the kitchen. She picked up the basket. She fed the birds. She latched the cage door behind her. And only then, only when the latch had clicked shut and the cage door was closed and the 27 creatures inside it were fed, did Amara Candy, at the age of 21, sit down on the brick of the courtyard and put her face in her hands and cry for her mother. She had learned at 6 that grief was something you were allowed to do only after the birds had eaten. But she had learned something else, too. She had learned that the birds, every one of them, from the scarlet macaws to the small yellow finches, knew her. Solomon, the gray parrot, whom Augustus had named after Amara's own father without knowing he was doing it, a fact she had gone very still upon learning at the age of 11, and had never once let Augustus see that she had gone still. Solomon would lean into her hand when she offered him a piece of apple. The scarlet macaws would stop fighting when she hummed to them under her breath. The finches would answer her humming with a low chatter of their own. The javan, the blackbird from the island in the eastern sea, would turn its head to follow her walk across the yard. She never told anyone. Who would she have told? Miriam the cook, perhaps, in the small, warm hours before the household woke? But Miriam already knew. Miriam had seen, over the years, the way the girl and the birds looked at each other, and Miriam had said only once, in a low voice, Child, do not let him see what you have with them. Do not let him see, because if he sees it, he will find a way to take it from you." Amara had nodded. She had not needed to be told twice. And Augustus Vail, who wrote to correspondents in London and Havana and New Orleans about the acquisition of new species, who had built the great iron cage in 1849 when the collection outgrew the wooden one, who considered himself the master of the finest private aviary in the state of South Carolina. Augustus Vail had come, without ever admitting it to himself, to trust one human being on his property more than any other with the thing he loved most. He trusted his birds to Amara. Not because he thought her his equal. He would have laughed at the suggestion. He trusted her because he had watched for 22 years, and he had understood, without ever letting the understanding rise to the surface of his mind, that the birds knew something about the girl that he himself did not. Which is why, on the morning of the 2nd of August, 1863, when Augustus Vail stood in his nightshirt at the window of his study and looked down into the brick courtyard and saw 27 birds sitting in dead silence on their perches, the first person he thought of was her. And the first person he was going to send for was her. But she was already coming. She was already crossing the yard. She was already almost at the wire. To understand what she was about to walk into, you have to go back 7 weeks, to the beginning of June 1863. It had been a bad summer on the Combahee River. Something had happened downriver in the first days of that June that nobody on Blackwater Ridge had, at first, quite believed. Union gunboats had come up the Combahee in the middle of the night. They had gone straight past the Confederate pickets. They had put ashore at 7 separate plantations, and in the space of a single night, a single, mad, screaming, torch-lit night on the 2nd of June, 1863, more than 750 enslaved people had run out of the rice fields and the cabins of the low country and had climbed, in their bare feet, carrying their babies and their old people and their few small possessions aboard the Union gunboats and had sailed away, downriver, toward Beaufort, toward the sea, toward a freedom that most of them had, an hour earlier, not dared to believe was real. The raid had been guided, though nobody on Blackwater Ridge yet knew this, by a small woman named Harriet Tubman. The 7 plantations that were emptied that night were not Blackwater Ridge, but they were close. And by the morning of the 3rd of June, when the smoke was still rising from the rice barns of the great Combahee estates, every planter along that river, including Augustus Vail, understood that the war had come to their front door in a way it had not come before. From that morning onward, Augustus Vail changed. Not all at once. Slowly, in the small increments that only a woman who had watched him for 22 years would notice. The first thing Amara noticed was in the 2nd week of June. Augustus had, for as long as she could remember, kept 2 matched bay horses in the stable, a driving pair purchased for a great deal of money in 1858 for the small carriage his late wife had loved to drive along the river road. In the 2nd week of June, one of those horses was gone. Augustus told the overseer, casually, at breakfast, that he had sold the horse to a Confederate colonel outside Charleston. But Amara, who fed the birds in the courtyard every morning, and who crossed the small piece of yard between the courtyard and the stable, and who knew the sound of both horses' voices better than she knew the sound of the overseer's, knew that the horse had not been sold. The horse had been quietly moved somewhere else, somewhere closer, somewhere Augustus could reach in a hurry. The second thing she noticed was in the 3rd week of June. The letters from Richmond had begun to arrive. There had been letters from Richmond for years. Augustus had a brother who kept a house on Church Hill in that city, and the brothers wrote each other once a month in a slow, polite correspondence that Miriam sometimes handled at the front hall table. But in the third week of June, a new kind of letter began. 2 a week, sometimes 3, delivered not by the ordinary post, but by hand, by riders who came up the river road at odd hours and who did not stay for a meal. Augustus took each letter into the study. He locked the door behind him. And in the mornings, when Amara passed the study on her way to the kitchen, she could smell, even in the heat of a low-country June, when no other fireplace in the house was lit, the sharp, particular smell of paper and ink and sealing wax being burned in the small fireplace under the mantel. The third thing she noticed was in the last week of June. Money. Not the presence of money, the disappearance of it. Augustus had for years kept a small silver box on the corner of his study desk, into which he dropped whatever coin remained in his coat pockets at the end of the day. It was a habit his wife had teased him about when she was alive. In the last week of June, the silver box disappeared from the desk. So did a small mother-of-pearl music box that his wife had given him on their 10th anniversary, and that had stood for 11 years since her death on the mantel over the fireplace. So did a pair of silver candlesticks from the dining room. Miriam noticed. Miriam did not say anything because on Blackwater Ridge Plantation, a cook who noticed the disappearance of silver was a cook who was blamed for it. But Miriam told Amara in a low voice one morning at the kitchen door, "He's turning things into money, child, and he's not putting the money in the bank, because I have not seen him ride to town." The fourth thing she noticed was a map. She saw it only once. It was on the 11th of July, a Saturday, in the late afternoon. She had come up to the second floor with a jug of cold water for the study because Augustus had rung for it. He had opened the door for her and had turned away for a moment to move a pile of papers off the desk before she set the jug down. And in that half-turn, she had seen, spread across the desk, the piece of paper the color of tea, marked with a coastline she did not know, with names of cities she could not read, and with a red line drawn in ink from a place on the coast of South Carolina, out across a wide blue expanse, to a small island shape with a name that ended in A. She did not know at that moment that she was looking at a map of the passage from Charleston to Havana. She only knew that Augustus Vail had folded the map very quickly before she was allowed to look at it a second time. She saw one more thing before the end of July. She saw the visitor. He came 3 separate times in the last weeks of July, always after dark, always alone. A lean, dust-covered man on a good horse in the plain clothes of a traveler. Amara saw him the first time from the door of her cabin in the dark because he rode past the quarters on his way up to the big house. She saw him the second time from the kitchen window, and the third time on the 25th of July, a Saturday night. She was still at the kitchen window when the man rode away in the dark, and she saw, in the lantern light on the porch, that Augustus Vail shook the man's hand before he mounted. Augustus Vail did not shake hands with couriers. Augustus Vail did not shake hands with white men below his station. Augustus Vail shook hands with a man he was doing business with. By the 26th of July, Amara had, without a single word being said and without her ever having been taught a word of reading, assembled in her own private way a picture of what her master was doing. He was going somewhere. He was going somewhere that required a map she did not recognize. He was turning silver into money, and money into gold, and gold into something small enough to carry. He was corresponding with his brother about it. He was meeting with a man who came at night, and a horse had been quietly moved to a place he could reach in a hurry. She did not yet know when. She did not yet know where he had hidden what he was going to carry. She found that out on the 27th of July, a Monday morning, at her ordinary hour, in the ordinary act of feeding the birds. As she reached to unlatch the small door at the base of the cage, the little door through which the feed trays slid in and out, she noticed that the brick foundation of the cage, on the side that faced the smokehouse, looked slightly different than it had looked the day before. Not much different. A small thing. A slightly darker line along the mortar between two of the bricks at the very bottom of the foundation, as though the mortar had recently been disturbed and had not yet weathered back to the color of the rest. She did not stop. She fed the birds, she latched the cage, she walked back to the kitchen. But she remembered. And that night, when the household was asleep, when the small, hard light of Augustus's lamp was showing at the edge of the study door, Amara did something she had never in her 28 years done before. She came out of the quarters. She walked in her bare feet across the yard. She came into the courtyard. She knelt at the side of the cage that faced the smokehouse. She put her small hand against the brick where the mortar looked darker. The brick moved. It moved a quarter of an inch under her hand, not more, but enough. It was loose. She looked up at the second floor. The light was still burning at the edge of the study door. She looked back at the brick. She put her fingers into the small gap where the mortar had been disturbed, and she pulled. The brick came out. Behind it, in a hollow space that had been cut at some point in the 22-year history of that cage's foundation into the very brickwork itself in a way that no man of Augustus Vale's class would ever, in 1,000 years, have thought to have inspected, there was a small, oilcloth-wrapped bundle. She took it out. She did not open it there. She put the brick back into its place, pressing the loose crumbs of dry mortar back into the gap with her thumb. She stood up. She walked back across the courtyard. She walked back to the quarters. She went into her cabin, the small one-room cabin she had lived in alone since her mother's death, and she closed the door, and she lit the single tallow candle she had been given the previous Christmas, and she sat down on the packed earth floor with the oilcloth bundle in her lap. She untied it. Inside were 3 things. A leather-bound ledger, thin, about 60 pages, written in Augustus Vale's careful, cramped hand. She could not read the words, but she could read numbers, and she could see in this small, hidden book that the numbers were very large. Not household numbers, not plantation numbers. Very large numbers, running down the right-hand side of every page, in columns. A small stack of letters, 6 of them, folded, sealed with red wax that had, on each of them, been broken and refolded. On the outside of every one, the same word written in the same hand. A word that started with the letter that begins the name, Richmond. And a small cloth pouch, heavy. She untied it. Inside were gold coins. She could not count them all in the candlelight. There were perhaps 40, perhaps 50, more money than she had ever seen in a single place in her whole life. She sat on the earth floor with the 3 things in her lap, and she began, very slowly, to understand. Augustus Vale, in the 7 weeks since the raid, had been preparing to run. Not from the war, not in the way any Confederate patriot would have run. He was going to leave. He was going to take his brother's connections in Richmond and the gold he had converted his silver into and the letters that contained the plan for his passage. And when the Union gunboats came again, as everyone on the Combahee now knew they would come again, Augustus Vale did not intend to be there. He did not intend to take his people with him. He did not intend to free them. He did not even, from the looks of the ledger, intend to write the plantation into his cousin's care. He intended, when the moment came, to walk out of Blackwater Ridge in the middle of the night with his gold in a saddlebag and his letters in his coat, and to leave 182 human beings to whatever the war would bring them. He had hidden the evidence of his plan in the one place on his property that no man of his class would ever have thought to search, under the brick foundation of the birdcage, guarded in a strange and unintended way by the 27 creatures inside it, who would, if any stranger approached the cage at night, have screamed the whole household awake. He had not counted on the small, dark shape who had, for 22 years, been the only human being the birds did not scream at. Amara wrapped the 3 things back in the oilcloth. She hid them under the loose floorboard beneath her bed. She blew out the candle. She lay down in the dark. And for the first time in her whole life, she thought, clearly, patiently, without letting the thought scare her, about running. Not the way she had thought about it as a girl, not the small wild wondering of a child. She thought about it the way a woman thinks. She thought, the boats will come again, and when they come, I will be on them. And so we come back to the courtyard, to Sunday morning, to the 2nd of August, 1863, to the moment we left her, Amara, in her plain gray dress with the covered basket in her hands, 20 feet from the iron cage in the last dark before dawn. She takes the last 3 steps to the cage. She stops at the wire. She lifts the cloth from the top of the basket, and she looks in through the bars at the 27 birds in the dark before the sun. They are all looking at her. Every one of them. 27 pairs of small round eyes in 27 small, still heads in the dead center of a silence that Amara has not heard in 22 years. And the black bird from Java, the Javan, the smartest of them, the one on the highest perch, the Javan tilts its head. It looks past her. It looks in the direction of the river. And Amara understands. The birds have not gone silent because something is wrong. The birds have gone silent because something is coming. She has spent her whole life around these creatures. She has watched them, in the 22 years she has fed them, react to 100 things human ears could not detect. A storm 40 miles away, 3 hours before the first cloud rose over the marsh. A hawk in the pines before any human being in the yard had seen it. The birds knew before the humans knew. And on this morning, the 2nd of August, 1863, the birds know that something is moving, somewhere in the direction of the Combahee, that they have not felt before. She does not know, standing at the wire in her gray dress, what it is. But she knows what she is going to do about it. She feeds them very quietly, very carefully, in the exact order she has fed them every morning for 22 years. Solomon first, then the macaws, one, then walk around, then the other, then the Amazons, then the cockatoos, then the finches, then the hoopoe, then, last, the Javan on the highest perch. And as she pushes the small tray of cut apple in through the door for the Javan, the blackbird makes a single low sound. Not the scream of the macaws, not the whistle of the Amazons, but a soft, deep, patient sound, almost like a word. For one long moment, she and the blackbird look at each other through the wire. Then she latches the cage. She turns. She walks in her ordinary morning way back across the courtyard toward the kitchen. But she does not go inside the kitchen. She goes around the back of it, along the small, worn path that runs behind the smokehouse and down toward the quarters. She walks in the ordinary way of a woman going about ordinary business. She is going to the cabin at the far end of the row, to the cabin of a man named Titus Freeman. Titus is 57 years old. He is Blackwater Ridge's chief boatman. He has, for 30 years, been the one who takes the plantation's small skiff down the tributaries of the Combahee. He knows every bend of the water within 20 miles. He knows every place where a small boat can slip past a Confederate picket in the dark. He knows, though no white man on the plantation has ever suspected him of knowing, that his own cousin Ephraim, on a neighboring place, was one of the 750 who slipped away on the night of the 2nd of June. And Titus has, ever since that night, been waiting. Amara knocks on the door of Titus Freeman's cabin at 10 minutes past 5 in the morning. He is awake. She stands in his doorway and she says, in a voice so quiet no other cabin on the row could possibly hear her, "Uncle Titus, the birds have gone silent." He looks at her. He looks at her for a long moment. And Titus Freeman, who has known Amara since she was born, who has watched her walk out to that cage every morning of her life since she was 6 years old, who has understood the way the old men and women in the quarter understand things without ever saying them, exactly what a silence in that direction means, says, in the same very quiet voice, "How long?" "Since I came out. Maybe longer." He nods slowly. "Come inside, child. Sit." She comes inside. She sits. And Titus Freeman, sitting on the edge of the low wooden bed frame in his one-room cabin in the gray dark of a Combahee River morning in August of 1863, tells her, in the smallest number of words a man has ever used to change another person's life, what he has been waiting for. He tells her that in the last 2 weeks, small groups from 3 separate plantations along the Combahee have been carried down to the mouth of the river by the boatmen of the Gullah community, men Titus has known his whole life. He tells her that a Union gunboat has been sighted twice at night at the mouth of the Combahee, not coming up, not yet, but sitting, watching. He tells her that there is talk in the Gullah cabins from Green Pond to Beaufort that something is coming. Not immediately, but soon. He tells her that if she has something that will slow the master, or confuse the master, or send the master looking in the wrong direction on the night the boats come, now is the time. She tells him about the ledger. She tells him about the letters. She tells him about the gold. Titus Freeman closes his eyes for a long moment. Then he opens them and he says, "Child, you go back. You feed those birds tomorrow morning like nothing has changed. Tonight, after the master is asleep, you bring me the letters. Not the gold, not the ledger, just the letters. I know a man in Green Pond who can read. If those letters say what you think they say, we will know what the master is planning, and we will know how much time we have." She stands up. She walks back across the yard, and by the time the sun is fully up on the 2nd of August, Amara Kande is back at her ordinary place, kneading the ordinary bread on the ordinary board in the ordinary corner of the big house kitchen, with a piece of information under her tongue that no other human being on Blackwater Ridge Plantation, except an old boatman named Titus, has any idea she is carrying. Before we go on, before I tell you what happened when Titus took those letters to Green Pond, before I tell you what Augustus Vail did in the 2nd week of August, before I tell you what happened at midnight at Cuckold's Creek, I want to ask you one small thing. Because I have been saying her name tonight for a long time now. Amara, Amara, Amara. And in a moment, in a scene we have not yet reached, you are going to hear Augustus Vail say it too. But he is going to say it as an owner says the name of a thing that belongs to him. And I want, before that happens, for her name to be said in one other place by one other person who is not a slaveholder in South Carolina in 1863. type her name once in the comments, just once. Amara. Because in a country that spent 246 years trying to make sure the names of women like her were never written down, the small, ordinary act of typing her name in a comment on a video tonight, wherever you are, is one small piece of justice we still have in our hands. Do that now, and then come back. Amara brought Titus the letters that night. She slipped the 6 folded letters wrapped in a scrap of oilcloth under the loose board at the back of Titus Freeman's woodpile. She walked back to her cabin. She did not sleep. Titus took them to Green Pond the next afternoon, hidden in the false bottom of the small tackle box he carried when he went to fish the tidal creeks. The man he knew in Green Pond was a free black carpenter named Absalom Judson. Absalom read the letters in silence at his kitchen table. Then he looked up at Titus, and he said in a voice Titus would remember for the rest of his life, "Titus, this man is fixing to run to Havana. He has bought passage on a blockade runner out of Charleston. He has a Confederate agent who is going to meet him at midnight on the 10th of August at the crossing at Cuckold's Creek with the papers. He is planning to go with what he can carry on one horse. He is not taking a single one of his people. He is going alone." Titus sat at the kitchen table for a long moment. Then he said, "When are the Union boats coming?" Absalom Judson looked at him. "That I do not know. But the word from Beaufort is soon." Titus rode back to Blackwater Ridge that night with the letters folded back into his tackle box. He returned them before dawn to the same loose board behind his woodpile. Amara took them back at first light. She put them back under the loose floorboard beneath her bed. Then she walked out to the cage and she fed the birds exactly as she had for 22 years. She had 7 days. But on the 5th morning, on Friday, the 7th of August, something happened that Amara had not planned for. She had come out to the cage at her ordinary hour. She had fed the birds in her ordinary order. She had latched the cage door. And as she turned to walk back across the courtyard toward the kitchen, she saw Augustus Vail standing on the back porch of the big house in his dark morning coat, watching her. He had, in 22 years, come out onto that porch to watch her feed the birds perhaps 3 times. All 3 had been in the first year, when he was still deciding whether the small girl he had put in charge of them was reliable. He had not stood on that porch at that hour for 21 years. He was standing there now. She kept walking. She did not slow. She did not look up. She came to the porch step. She curtsied, a small, ordinary curtsy, and she started to walk past him. "Amara," she stopped. "Sir?" He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, in the small, careful voice of a man who has been thinking about a question and has not yet decided what to do with the answer, "The mortar at the base of the cage, on the smokehouse side. Has anyone been at it?" The whole world went very still. Amara did not, for a fraction of a second, know what her own face was doing. She did not know whether she had gone pale. She did not know whether she had gone still. She only knew, in the small, clear part of her mind that had been trained by 22 years of walking into that courtyard before dawn, that whatever her face was doing, it had to keep doing exactly what it did every other morning of her life. She looked up at him. She let a small, ordinary confusion come into her face. She said, "Sir?" "The mortar. There is a line at the base on the smokehouse side that looks disturbed." "Sir, I don't know. I go in the small door at the front. I don't look at the back." He watched her. He watched her for a long time, and Amara Kande, 28 years old, in her plain gray dress, on the back porch of a house she had lived in the shadow of her whole life, did the one thing she had been trained by 22 years of feeding those birds to do. She did not blink. She did not look away. She looked at Augustus Vale with the same steady, patient look she had given him every morning of every year since she was 6. He nodded once, slowly. "Go on to the kitchen, girl." She went, but halfway across the yard she understood something that made her stomach turn over inside her. He had not asked her whether she had been at the mortar. He had asked her whether anyone had been at the mortar, which meant that he had seen the disturbed line, which meant that he was now, in his own careful, cold way, testing the household. He had not yet decided who to suspect. He had begun with her because she was the one who went to the cage every morning, but he would not stop with her. By nightfall, he would have asked the smokehouse man. By the following morning, he would have asked Miriam. By the day after that, he would be watching every enslaved person on the property, and any one of them who moved wrong under his eye would become the answer to his question. And if he decided that Titus had been at the cage, if he decided that Titus Freeman, the chief boatman, the man who could reach every landing on the Combahee, the one man on the property whose disappearance would truly hurt him, had been at the cage, then Titus was finished. Titus would be in Prine's punishment shed by the following evening, and the whole plan, the letters, the boats, the escape, was finished with him. She had, from that moment on the porch, perhaps 24 hours. Not 7 days. 24 hours. She walked into the kitchen. She said nothing to Miriam. She took her ordinary place at the ordinary board. She kneaded the ordinary bread. And in the small, clear part of her mind, she began, for the first time in her whole life, to plan, alone, without Titus, without Miriam, without anyone, the thing she was about to do. She went to Titus's cabin that night. She told him what Augustus had said on the porch. She saw Titus's face go very still in the candlelight, and she said in a voice that was not the voice of a girl who had come to him for instructions, but the voice of a woman who had come to him with a decision. "Uncle Titus, we do not have 7 days. We have tonight and tomorrow night, and that is all." Titus looked at her. Then he said, "Then we go tomorrow night." They went the next night, the 8th of August. Titus and Amara and Miriam had known without a single word being said and had made her own decision and had told Amara only at the kitchen door that morning, "Child, you thought I would let you go alone?" And 3 of the men Titus had trusted for years, Cato from the rice mill, Isaac, the field driver, and Josiah, Titus's own sister's 17-year-old boy. 6 of them. They came out of their cabins one at a time, at spaced intervals, in the last dark before the moon rose. They met at the small landing on the tributary Titus had chosen, where his cousin Ephraim's oldest boy Nathan was waiting with a flat-bottomed skiff and a single shielded lantern. Amara carried nothing but the small pouch of hard biscuit at her hip, a fishing knife bound inside her sleeve, and the gray dress on her body. She did not carry the gold. She did not carry the ledger. She did not carry the letters. She had made the decision, sitting on the floor of her cabin that afternoon, that the gold and the ledger and the letters would stay exactly where they were. Because Augustus Vale was going to ride out on the horse he had quietly moved on the night of the 10th of August, 2 nights from now, to meet a Confederate agent at Cuckold's Creek. And Titus had, 3 days earlier, sent word through the Gullah network that the meeting at Cuckold's Creek at midnight on the 10th might be a place where certain people, on certain nights, might find it interesting to be. Amara did not need to carry Augustus Vale's escape. She needed only to let it happen, exactly as he had planned it, into a country that was no longer the country he thought it was. They pushed off at 11:30 on the night of the 8th of August. She did not look back at Blackwater Ridge. She looked instead downriver, in the direction the Javan had been looking 6 mornings before when the birds went silent. She looked toward the sea. The skiff moved down the Combahee through the small hours of the 9th of August. Titus knew the water. He knew where the Confederate pickets stood along the west bank and where they did not. He knew the small, dark inlet 10 miles downriver where the Gullah boatmen of the mouth of the Combahee had, in the 2 months since the June raid, established a small, unofficial waiting place, hidden behind a screen of cypress and Spanish moss, where refugees from the upriver plantations gathered by 1s and 2s and 3s and waited. They reached the inlet at 4 in the morning. Others were already there. 2 families with small children, 3 young men, an old woman with a face so lined it was hard to say her age, who was sitting on the bank with her feet in the water, and who looked up at Amara as the skiff slid in and said, "Child, you got out." Amara sat down on the bank next to the old woman, and she took off her worn brogans, and she put her own feet in the black water of the Combahee, and she began, for the first time since the morning of the 2nd of August, to cry. She cried for a long time. The old woman on the bank did not tell her to stop. The old woman only said after a while, "Child, you cry until you're done. Then you dry your face. And then you get ready. Because the boats will come." And in this story, the boats did come. Not a great raid the way the June raid had been, a smaller expedition, of the kind that Union commanders were quietly running out of Beaufort through the second summer of the war. Small gunboats moving up at night into the mouths of the Combahee and the Ashpoo, gathering the refugees who had been waiting at hidden landings, carrying them down and out into St. Helena Sound and south to Beaufort, which had been in Union hands since 1861. Amara stepped off the boat at Beaufort in the middle of August of 1863, in her one gray dress, with the small pouch of hard biscuit still at her hip and the fishing knife still in her sleeve. She was, in the eyes of the United States Army, a contraband of war. She would spend the next 19 months in the freedmen's camp at Port Royal, where thousands of formerly enslaved people from the Low Country were being resettled, and where Northern schoolteachers had, since 1862, been teaching the alphabet to men and women who had been forbidden by law from learning it. She learned the alphabet at the age of 28, at a wooden table in a schoolroom built inside a former cotton warehouse, with a piece of chalk in a hand that had, for 22 years, held a feed basket for 27 birds. She learned to write her own name, Amara, on the 5th day of her schooling. And in this story, when she wrote her own name for the first time and looked down at it on the paper, she sat perfectly still for a long time. Because for the first 28 years of her life, her name had been a thing other people said. It had never been a thing she had made. And now, she had made it. In her own hand, in 4 letters that would, from that day forward, outlive her. And what of Augustus Vail? He did not reach Havana. At midnight on the 10th of August, at the crossing at Cuckold's Creek, 3 men were waiting for him instead of 1. 2 of them had been sent by Absalom Judson of Green Pond. In the short, ugly fight that took place on the sandy bank of Cuckold's Creek in the darkness of that August night, Augustus Vail was struck in the temple by the butt of a pistol, and his saddlebag of gold and his pouch of letters were carried away. He did not die that night. He was found at dawn in the sand by a passing Confederate patrol, and he was carried back to Blackwater Ridge with a wound in his skull and no memory at that moment of who he was. He recovered his memory over the following weeks, but not his fortune. The gold was gone, the letters were gone, and by the time he had recovered his wits, 6 of his own people were gone with them. The overseer, Prine, when he came to the study to make his report, was struck by the way Augustus Vale sat perfectly still at his desk while the names were read out, and said only, at the end, one sentence. "The bird cage. Has anyone fed the birds?" Prine looked at him, and Prine said, in the small, careful voice of a white man who is beginning to understand that his employer's world is ending, "Nobody knows how, sir." The birds of Augustus Vale did not, in the end, all die. 12 of them did, 7 of the finches, both pairs of Amazons, and the hoopoe from Egypt, within 3 weeks. Solomon the gray parrot survived because Miriam's youngest daughter Sarah, who had stayed behind because at 10 years old her mother had judged the journey too dangerous, took over the feeding as best she could. The scarlet macaws survived. The cockatoos survived. And the Javan, the black bird from the island in the eastern sea, survived Augustus Vale himself. Augustus Vale died in the winter of 1866 of an illness the doctor could not name, in a Blackwater ridge that no longer belonged to him. The plantation had been broken up in 1865. The rice fields, most of them, had been divided into small parcels. Some of the men and women who had once lived in the quarters had, by 1866, bought back the very ground they had worked as slaves. Solomon the gray parrot was given, in the settlement of Augustus Vale's estate, to a neighbor. And in this story, Solomon lived another 41 years. To the end of his life, he would sometimes, without any warning, in the voice that had once been Augustus Vale's, say the word, Amara. The neighbor's grandchildren did not know what the word meant. They thought it was a bird sound. They repeated it to each other and laughed. And Amara Kande? She left the Port Royal camp in the spring of 1865. She married Titus Freeman, who had, in the 2 years since the escape, become her constant companion, in a small Baptist church in Beaufort on the 4th of July, 1865. They had one daughter, born in 1867, whom Amara named Nell, after her mother. They moved north in 1871, not because the South had become impossible, though for many freedmen it had, but because Amara had come to believe that her daughter would be safer and would go further in a country where the memory of Blackwater Ridge could not reach her. They settled in a small black community in western New York. Titus worked as a boatman until his death in 1889. Amara worked, until she was too old to work, as a laundress. She read the newspaper every day. She read the Bible on Sundays. She never, until her last year, returned to South Carolina. She returned in the spring of 1907. She was 72 years old. Her daughter Nell, who was by then a schoolteacher, went with her. They took the train down through Virginia and the Carolinas. They arrived at Beaufort. They hired a small cart and a driver, and they went up the Combahee River Road, and on a clear afternoon in April of 1907, Amara Kande stood, for the first time in 44 years, in the courtyard of Blackwater Ridge Plantation. The big house was still standing. It had passed in 1878 to a northern buyer who had turned it into a hunting lodge. The rice fields had gone back to marsh. The quarters were gone. But the cage, the great iron cage, 12 feet across, 8 feet tall, wrought in Charleston in 1849 in the shape of a small ornamental palace, was still standing. It was empty. It was rusted. Its dome had been broken by a storm years earlier. But it was standing. Amara walked in her long, dark traveling dress across the courtyard toward it. She did not at first speak. She stood at the wire, or what was left of the wire, and she put her hand, at 72 years old, on the same iron bar she had put her small hand on when she was 6. She stood at that cage for a very long time. She did not weep. She did not speak. And then, at last, she said one sentence out loud, to nobody in particular, in the empty courtyard of the empty plantation. "You knew, didn't you? You knew before I did." She was not talking to her daughter, who was standing 5 paces behind her and who did not understand at first who her mother was addressing. She was talking to the birds. She was talking to the 27 small creatures who had, on a Sunday morning in August of 1863, in the dark before the dawn, gone silent all at once, and had, in their small animal way, told her, before any human being on that plantation had known, that the world she had been born into was ending. She was talking to Solomon the gray parrot, who had died 4 months earlier in a parlor in Charleston, with her name still on his tongue, though she did not know that. She was talking to the Javon, the blackbird from the island in the eastern sea, who had turned its head toward the river on the morning that changed her life. She was thanking them. Amara Cande Freeman died in the fall of 1908 in her daughter Nell's house in western New York. She was 73 years old. Her daughter wrote down, that same evening, the last thing her mother had said. Her mother had said, "Tell the child, when she is old enough, about the birds. Tell her that the Lord gives you what you need in the shape of what is already in your hand. And tell her, this is the important part, that the day the birds went quiet, that was the day the world spoke to me. Tell her not to be afraid of quiet things." She was buried in a small plot her daughter and son-in-law had bought. Her stone is small. It does not mention Blackwater Ridge. It does not mention the Combahee. It says only what she asked in her last week for it to say. She heard the silence. That is the story. That is the whole story. A 28-year-old enslaved woman in a plain gray dress on a Sunday morning in August of 1863, standing in a brick courtyard on a rice plantation along the Combahee River, holding a covered basket in her hands, listening to 27 birds not make a sound, and understanding in that small, still moment that the animals she had fed for 22 years had heard something she could not hear, and that if she trusted them, the way she had trusted them every morning of her life, they would guide her out. The people of Blackwater Ridge who survived that summer called that morning for the rest of their lives the Great Silence, not because it was the silence of the birds, but because it was the silence in which one small enslaved woman heard, for the first time in 28 years, the possibility of her own name being spoken by nobody but herself. If this story has stayed with you tonight, if you have walked with her in the dark before dawn on the 2nd of August, 1863, from a brick courtyard on the Combahee to an empty, rusted cage 44 years later, do one small thing for her. Say her name once, out loud, before you close this video. Amara. Because in a country that spent 246 years trying to make sure the names of women like her were never written down, the small, ordinary act of speaking her name is the one small piece of justice that is still in our hands. Then share this with someone you love, because someone you love needs to hear that on a Sunday morning in August of 1863, on a rice plantation on the Combahee River, 27 exotic birds went silent all at once, and one small enslaved woman who had fed them every morning of the last 22 years understood in that silence that it was time to go. And if you want to keep walking with me through these forgotten corners of history, the names that were never allowed to be written, the stories the guidebooks will never tell you, then stay a while. Subscribe. Turn on the bell. If this story truly moved you tonight, a super thanks below this video helps me keep sitting up at this desk in the dark, telling you the next name and the name after that. But that is for another night. For tonight, only this. Remember her. Her name was Amara. There are so many more names waiting in the dark of these old southern marshes. We are not done speaking them.